I don't know if I need to introduce myself really. Kevin, just a PhD student from Finland, and it's been an honor to be part of this conference. And also, it's interesting to meet all of you because literally, like, my dissertation's entire bibliography is in attendance. It's kind of a funny experience. Today, I will condense my dissertation into a 20-minute talk, really. I usually investigate Henry Miller and Hubert Selby Jr., if anyone's familiar, but here I will only share my findings about Miller. I consider him part of the late modernist period of literature, which peaked in the 1930s, and this time frame enables correlations with existentialist thinkers of the time. Late modernist literature presents individuals as both lost within the crowd and free to express themselves through societal collapse. Trust in a flawed human spirit and one's corporeality was supposed to crush the artifice of modern life. Writers like William Burroughs, for example, clearly inherited the bleak tone that Miller and other European writers created. Where then are the discussions of existentialist thought in Miller today? While the cosmopolitan Miller understandably has been studied in many different ways, be it as a transcendentalist, modernist, anarchist, or Buddhist, his residency in the cradle of French existentialism has not raised many academic eyebrows. So I will explain how a philosophical portrayal can resolve scholarly conflicts about his contradictory message. Although his apocalyptic outlook hints at hope and transcendence, Miller's late modernist wavering arrives at an impasse between belief and disillusionment. So the questions I seek to answer are the following. How is existential absurdity presented in Miller, and how fruitful is his response to meaninglessness? Is corporeality the saving grace or final prison of late modernist characters? And lastly, what are the possibilities of mysticism as an antidote to a miserable existence? To very briefly now theorize late modernism, these quotes summarize some core features. Stevenson calls it a moment between the seriousness and skepticism of the Pound Elliott era and the play and irreverence of postmodernism. Through late modernist writers like Miller, modernism recognizes its futility in the face of mass conformism, world wars, and genocide. Novels of the 30s were peak representatives with writers like Céline and Miller, early Beckett, early Durrell, Flann O'Brien, if anyone's familiar. They present a depressing reality which can no longer be transcended. Narratorial responses often feature defeatism and absurdity. The idea of having nothing left to lose created unique styles and plots which rejected the idea of guiding readers towards truth or meaning. Late modernism anticipates downfall. Any last uprising of the individual means anarchy. Hence, Miller's stories are not about becoming a moral seeker of meaning, but about enjoying a degraded environment by exposing one's flesh to food, drink, and sex. These 6 thinkers here form my approach to Miller, but I will barely get into the very complicated specifics today. More generally, what do I mean by anti-humanist existentialism? So after World War II, there was French thinker Jean-Paul Sartre. He formulated that existence precedes essence. This is possibly the only commonplace people really associate with existentialist thought. But already a century prior, we had Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche, and they also held that essence was rooted in existence. That is, in active reflection and in immersion in an external world. French existentialism was mostly atheist. It was foregoing Kierkegaard's empowerment of individuality through belief, so Kierkegaard was a Christian, as well as Nietzsche's deification of mankind through irrationalism. Activity rather than passivity in the face of despair entered philosophy, and it would also enter late modernist novels. Sartre's lecture, Existentialism is a Humanism, from 1946, constitutes the moment existentialism becomes aware of itself as a movement. Then many philosophers distanced themselves from it, like Miller's 3 contemporaries down here, Émile Cioran, Albert Camus, and Maurice Merleau-Ponty. This is partially due to the contestable nature of Sartre's identification of existentialism with humanism, and this signaled a shift from an anti-humanist ambivalence to political humanisms and old metaphysical commitments. Now, while it is not my aim to change the perception of Sartre as a humanist, I do find anti-humanist strains in all existentialists. Sartre's views merely serve as a whiteboard for developing my contrasting understanding of existentialism. So here are 4 claims of mine. Firstly, I find that existentialist perspectives cannot ascribe to political or ethical systems as authentic means for solving existential crises. So this is contra Sartre's turn to Marxism and social responsibility. Instead, I apply Jack Reynolds' reading of Kierkegaard to all the existentialists, and I quote, "Morality resides in the character and attitudes of the person who is acting, a kind of virtue ethics," unquote. So, collective redemption is dismissed as utopian. Secondly, I reject the humanist basis of existentialism. Like late modernist fiction, existentialist thought in its optimistic moments does uplift the individual, but it always eventually crushes transcendental potential. Anti-humanism here means a stance of opposition. That is, quote, "Humanism became a radically destructive fantasy, which in the name of preserving the self, destroys its genuine and fragile selfhood and produces an illusion that is ultimately as violent as it is misconceived," unquote. The concept of freedom, for example, loses its enlightenment connotations when existentialists highlight a slave's experience of joy in forced labor, or how prisoners deprived of activity can actually experience freedom. And this is Camus and Sartre for you. Thirdly, while existence preceding essence is indeed the starting point for existentialist inquiries, I argue that every such thinker implies a given essentiality, whether of religious, natural, or unknown origins. Characters are led down set paths and desperately struggle to change course, but they can't. And lastly here, religion and atheism appear interchangeable in existentialism. I agree here with philosopher Georg Lukács, who explains how Nietzsche, for example, transformed the argument of his atheism into myth, and how Schopenhauer rendered Buddhism worldly. And I find that in a way there's a religious core really to every existentialist approach, because each is predicated upon the fall of mankind and magnifies the experience of life. Late modernist existentialism remains uncertain about whether to praise or ridicule authentic religiosity. Now, enough of all of that theory stuff, let's talk about Miller. So for this section, I will only focus on the reflective opening of Cancer. Boris is the first of many characters that the eye narrator uses to voice his own thoughts here. And this way, the narrator becomes a hive mind of decline in Cancer. In this quote, it becomes really unintelligible where Boris's words end and where the narrators begin. And we've heard the last bit of this many times, but whatever. Boris has just given me a summary of his views. He's a weather prophet. The weather will continue bad, he says. There will be more calamities, more death, more despair, not the slightest indication of a change anywhere. Cancer of our time is eating us away, yada yada, you know that. So the traditional hero usually gives way to the anti-hero in modernist fiction. And that's usually an insignificant mass man. Miller and his companions, however, are overall madmen. They neither fit the paradigms of heroes nor anti-heroes. They fulfill their depraved desires and possess ill bodies. They're physically, psychologically, and spiritually damaged. However, they are presented as truly alive in opposition to the clean and superficially sane. In late modernism, flirtation with death becomes a sign of vitality. Death is not described as freedom, but confinement, which follows confinement in existence, signified by the word lockstep. Thus, a pessimistic determinism in life and in death is postulated on the novel's first page. It follows that all attempts at transcendence must fail. In 1942, Albert Camus defines the human condition in similarly deterministic terms. To him, authorities force us to repeat meaningless actions throughout life, with us having no means to escape that. Camus' suggestion is to find joy in meaninglessness, to manufacture and project meaning onto our environment and its objects. And this is what Miller does. He lives among the spiritually void masses rather than removing himself. He takes in all the pleasures his times offer knowing that there's no point to the pursuit of values. Miller is trapped in a cycle of suffering and renders his suffering enjoyable in order to welcome the inevitable collapse of a society in his late modernist eschatology. Or, as per Camus, the descent takes place in joy. It is now the fall of my second year in Paris. I was sent here for a reason I have not yet been able to fathom. I have no money, no resources, no hopes. I am the happiest man alive, and there are no more books to be written, thank God. So Miller has a hidden purpose to unveil. Paris will reveal his essence to him. To satisfy primal necessities like the hunt for food or women is to uncover the self. Notably, and in late modernist manner, the notion of purpose is postulated, yet it remains abstract. While high modernism remembers the notions of self, human nature, or community, late modernism undergoes an existentialist turn. Miller's I-narrator applies Camus' definition of absurdity. The philosopher's feeling of absurdity arises from the conflict between one's desire to solve life's ontological mysteries on the one hand, and then the frustration of receiving no answers from the world. What does it mean? If I ask what's the meaning of life, the world is pretty unclear about it. So pointless hope emerges, according to Camus, when this contradiction is not accepted. And this mirrors Miller's perspective, who rejects the concept of hope and deifies existence itself. In existentialist writing, actions define purpose. The power of art, separated from existence, can no longer be believed in, which is where Miller also breaks with the high modernists and joins the existentialists. The artist's existence itself becomes the emancipatory moment, not his words. Now let's look at Black Spring's second chapter, third or fourth day of spring, and let's talk about corporeality here. My application of Merleau-Ponty's philosophy amplifies the interpretation of this anti-narrative. So here, very short quote by Merleau-Ponty: "The body is our general medium for having a world." To him, bodies execute their own intentions, and our mind fails to catch up with those intentions. Flesh autonomously and constantly adjusts its intentions in fusion with our environment. Our minds fail to decipher our bodily trajectories. And Miller approaches temporality in the same vein when he proposes that one must act as if the past were dead and the future unrealizable. Each step forward is the last, and with it a world dies, oneself included. The body reconstitutes itself with every physical action taken. After first elaborating on his childhood, Miller reflects on his corporeal divinity. Topical jumps from being diseased to being incarnated are recurring here. The I-narrator mixes biology, spirituality, and art. And as he writes, he's a man of God and a man of the devil, nothing eternal, nothing absolute. Before me always the image of the body, our triune God of penis and testicles. I can never forget that this holy trinity is man-made, that it will undergo infinite changes. So, to Miller, spirit is created by bodies, when genitalia are blasphemously sanctified. Late modernism presupposes loss of faith. The author transfigures a Christian language now devoid of power in the interwar era to write new, absurd scripture. Accordingly, nothing eternal characterizes Miller's anthropocentric trinity. Human bodies are repeatedly transformed by alienating environments, so that the only perception of eternity lies in the persistence of biology. The path through the grave ideally leads people through infinite changes, which transform the diseased body. The reward, authenticity, not health. Miller trusts a seemingly spontaneous present, which truly just executes the body's steps towards reaching equilibrium with the world. This is again Merleau-Ponty. To Miller, the fractured self is worth admiring when, quote, "We are that which is never concluded, never shaped to be recognized. All there is and yet not the whole, the parts so much greater than the whole." So existence shapes yet never accomplishes essence. In late modernism, we by default cannot be or even have a body. In late modernism, the body always has us. Only despair about existence enables being body, and thus the anti-humanist dream of a pre-reflective life. The fragmented self pursues excruciating experiences in search of further fragmentation. and hence Miller surrenders to the destructive, disintegrating elements that surround me. I bend over to spy on the secret processes, to obey rather than to command. So I feel like scholars who stress Miller's allegiance to Nietzsche's vitalism miss such important life-negating cues. Miller merges with the self-satisfied last men, if you know the Nietzschean concept. He merges with the last men of Western civilization, whose bodies are no longer sites of meaning, as Merleau-Ponty would have it. Miller takes advantage of those who betray their impulses to decline. Yet, Miller's body only offers wisdom when dominated by the secret processes. The spiritless collective necessarily becomes part of Miller and his many selves. Existence is rendered a reciprocal venture. In the interwar era, being authentic means spiritual degradation. His deaths and rebirths serve to act as if the author Miller reveals fundamental truths. In reality, Miller offers his body turned into anti-literature to the audience. There are no lessons taught by Black Spring, as the collection is the mere attempt to write away layers of self, to expose a vulnerable, externally conditioned I. Late modernist literature turns existentialism into a palliative measure to alleviate the degenerate body. Here's the third and last analytical chapter. So I already wrote on Schopenhauer's and Choran's mysticism in the current volume of Nexus, so you can read that, but here I will simply uncover the Kierkegaardian aspects of the same material. As I find, Kierkegaard despises mystics who lose themselves in spiritual realms. So the philosopher finds that one must keep one foot in the world, if you will. And this is why he admires the biblical Abraham, if you're familiar with the story. Abraham obeys God's command to sacrifice his son Isaac, but at the same time Abraham retains the love for his son in the moment he kills them, because that's an ethical imperative as a father to, love your child. So Kierkegaard loves this contradiction and this upholding of, being religious and ethical. And Kierkegaard writes, "Only he who was in anguish finds repose. Only he who descends into the underworld rescues the beloved. Only he who draws the knife gets Isaac." So I find that Miller alternates between a Kierkegaardian, life-affirming perspective on mysticism and the struggles for self-annihilation that Schopenhauer, for instance, undertakes. Capricorn is a reflection on an abandoned American past by a new Miller. Spiritual characters populate the novel. Defying a conformist society, they accompany the narrator's character development. One example that reveals Miller's conception of mysticism is Grover Waters. His body is described in terms of decay, and his clubfoot only adds to the impression of impairment. Already early in the novel, Miller refers to a clubfoot as proof for a retainment of life in death, equal to hair growing on a corpse. What sets Waters apart from other mystics Miller encounters is his artistic side. Waters, in fits of rage, would take his fists and pound the piano like a madman. It was his genius coming out the wrong way. So heightened emotionality can become a sign of greatness in Miller's evaluations, and it can cause justifiable aggressions, which need to be directed towards a worthy pursuit like art and not remain empty violence. This also goes along with Miller's own devilishness at the telegraph company, where he initially mistreats its workers, which then later turns into a benevolent communion with them. Eventually, the creative and emotional Waters is converted. Even though this character preaches religion to people now and gives up on art, Miller is surprisingly positive about Waters' change. The narrator admires the displayed neglect for all duties and obligations besides those to God. Waters is unethical and only cares about his relationship to the deity. He's therefore removed from doctrines and leads an obedient yet simultaneously defiant life, much like Kierkegaard. But now here one must ask why Miller describes Waters' conversion to Christianity as a lucky event, even if it stripped him of his emotional outbursts and creativity, because after all this was crucial for the narrator's rejection of characters still in Cancer. According to the changed point of view in Capricorn, Miller can now accept that people actually utilize pre-existing ideologies or beliefs to reach a personal destiny. The Christian Watris achieves the same spiritual stage as Miller's father in the book. He becomes overwhelmingly alive when convinced of the dead certainty of death. So in a conclusion here that would have not been uttered in Cancer, in my opinion, the narrator in Capricorn finds that it's a pity that Watris had to use Christ for a crutch. But then what does it matter how one comes by the truth, so as long as one pounces upon it and lives by it? So to embrace one's essence, one must form temporary attachments to simulations like Christianity, rather than rejecting everything human. Watris must give up the elitist belief in the arts and turn towards asceticism. It is notable that no Christian idea of transcendence enters the certainty of death here, which proves Miller's compatibility with existentialist perspectives on mysticism. Kierkegaard proposes taking a leap of faith, daring to kill what is most precious on earth, to follow a perceived higher purpose. The reward is not salvation, but becoming oneself, and this in itself is the divine pursuit. And to me, this is the mystical dimension in Miller. So, to conclude, I do not intend to deny the humanist aspects of Miller, and we've heard a lot about his humanism in all kinds of presentations here. However, they always only coexist with his anti-humanism, I find. And the anti-humanism strongly feeds into his writing of the 30s in particular. Rather than resolving them, scholars should maybe learn to appreciate the contradictions and the balancing acts of Miller's as representative of literature and philosophy that did not have any more advice to offer to a world on the brink of World War II. Late modernism desperately probed how one could still exist. The answer? One must seek primitivism when recognizing the meaninglessness of civilized life and the impossibility of transcendence in mysticism. Thank you.